Hello, I welcome all of you to the virtual event Resilience and Children on the Move. My name is Laura von Saint-André. I work at the German Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development in the Division Special Initiative on Forced Displacement. Dear partners and colleagues, in the past weeks and months we have seen multiple crises develop. For example, the emergency situation in Afghanistan, economic crisis in Lebanon, and a developing pandemic that has been testing for everyone. For those who live in violent conflicts and displacement, the COVID-19 pandemic adds to an already very adverse situation. In the last year, more than 40% of all displaced persons worldwide were children below the age of 18. New UNHCR estimates show that almost 1 million children were born as refugees within the last 2 years. Children and young people are highly affected by violence, interrupted educational pathways, loss of economic safety of their families. The consequences of conflict and displacement can have a lasting impact on children and young people's self-confidence, relationships, and future prospects. Just this week, Save the Children published a report showing that factors such as displacement, a lack of COVID-19 vaccines, and attacks on schools are jeopardizing access to schooling for millions of children. At the same time, violence and abuse, including child labor, is on a rise. Psychosocial support can provide children with spaces of relative safety and moments of joy and relief. This is not enough to fix the situation, but it is an important start. Despite the knowledge we have about the negative impact of crisis on children, gaps in the response are still visible. And let me, before I come to the challenges, thank all of you who work in this environment. I acknowledge a lot the importance of your work. BMZ is trying to support more and more psychosocial components in the projects that we finance. Under the Special Initiative on Forced Displacement, which I work for, there are more than 60 projects that foster psychosocial well-being of refugees and displaced people. Let me highlight 3 challenges that I think I understood as such. Firstly, children usually feel relieved if they are able to express and communicate their distress. Creating safe spaces and finding ways for children to express their distress and giving information in a child-friendly manner is essential. Following a sports for development approach in Jordan and Iraq, we, for example, organize common sport activities for more than 80,000 displaced children and those living in host communities. These activities can be a booster for their confidence. Children can learn how to deal with conflicts in a child-friendly manner. Second, psychosocial support for children needs all actors of the support system and the community to work together. This includes families, health professionals, teachers, social workers, as well as religious actors. This is why BMZ cooperates closely with implementing partners, including civil society actors and faith-based organizations. Lastly, religion and spirituality can improve how people cope with distress. Faith can provide a sense of structure and belonging and offer connection to a community. Designing psychosocial approaches in a faith-sensitive way builds on these opportunities. In our special initiative on displacement and jointly with our partners, we have developed a guiding framework on mental health and psychosocial support that serves as guidance for our work. It acknowledges the crucial role of religion as a source for coping with stress. In conclusion, we believe that psychosocial well-being is the very foundation for a society to develop new visions for a peaceful future. Therefore, psychosocial aspects need to be integrated into our response in all sectors. You cannot build up a society and engage economically if you feel stressed and depressed. Religion and spirituality have the potential to create communities in which children and youth can express themselves without being judged, excluded, or given up on, and instead regain their confidence. We need to build on the strengths and on the potential of children. Thank you very much.
Good day, everyone. My name is Innocent Ofonya. I'm a trainee for World Vision Germany. I'm originally from Gulu, Uganda, and I moved here in 2016 for my studies. And after my studies, I got this wonderful opportunity to work with an organization that has been my home for quite a while now. But before I tell you more about that, I, I have some basic questions that I would like to share with you based on my experience as a former internally displaced child. We were put in the refugee camps in the late 1998, and we had to stay because the war from the LRA was taking its toll. But besides that, I was also involved in the war directly, where I was moved away from northern Uganda to South Sudan, and I had to move away from my family at the age of 10. The first question, which is on the challenges that I faced during while I was in the displacement camp or during my move to the displacement camp, was the biggest challenge was always the feeling of, the lack of necessities, the basic needs, the very vital things that I needed as a child. Because in the camp, basically we had nothing. We were on the receiving ends. We had to wait for food to be given. We had to wait for someone to come and give us medical support. We had to wait for basically everything. So for a child, that for me was really hard. Of course, I had a lot of fun playing with other kids, but that was the hardest part. And I would tell you also on specifically what I remember most was that sometimes you have to wait until the end of the month before you get food from World Food Program through World Vision. And then if this food delays, sometimes you plan and it doesn't reach the exact time. So it was really challenging. But on the other question of what role did faith play during this time, I I would say faith played quite a huge role, not only during the time that I was in the internally displaced persons camp, but also as a former child soldier. When I returned, when I escaped and came back home, I went to a rehabilitation center, which to me was another displacement camp because I wasn't able to stay with my family. I was displaced first to South Sudan, and even after returning from South Sudan, I was still in a center, confined. And for me, I first thought, why can't they send me to my family direct? But then the question was answered towards the end of my stay, where during this time we were taught a lot of values, life values. And this was done by World Vision as a faith-based organization. They introduced us to a lot of religious lifelines and showed us that God is love, and actually love is what we needed, not war, not fights against each other. So faith played a really big role, and it still keeps playing a big role in my life, even now that I'm an adult. What was there any support that you received from faith-based organization? Definitely from World Vision, I received a lot of counseling, and this counseling extended to my family too, because they had to talk to my mother on how to help me when I was, for example, after the LRA war, but also during the time we were in the camp, we had a lot of prayer services because it was so stressful that a mother cannot just sit there watch children go angry, and because sometimes it became a very big mental challenges for them, and they needed the basic counseling. And World Vision as a faith organization was right there doing all the best they could. And basically, besides the food support they gave, there was also a lot of emotional support to my family, to me as a person, and to a lot of young people in the camps. What were some of the needs for children that you have seen during this time? Children had a lot of gaps in their needs, from food, like I already said, to medical needs, to education. When we were in the camps, basically you work on the soldiers' timetable. The soldiers will tell you when it's safe to go outside the camp, when it's not safe, or basically if you should go to school or not. So basically we had to wait for orders from the soldiers who were protecting the camps. So as a child, I felt like there was a lot of gap to coordinate, to play freely. But above all, I also had a lot of emotional stress because I was born in a happy-free environment, and all of a sudden I'm kept in a very tiny space where I basically cannot run around. I can't do the things that I used to do, and that was really hard. And it wasn't just for me, but for a lot of kids And I remember a lot of kids of my age, including me at some point, we went and did quarry work. And quarry work is basically you do a whole lot of, you break a lot of stones only to get 200 shillings, which 200 shillings is in euro is like 0.2 cents or something. So there was a lot of exploitation of child labor, and also this affected it a lot. But if you, in a couple of years, we're leading an organization helping. I would say if I was to have an organization, or if I was leading an organization helping children who are on the run, or refugees children, my biggest wish would be to have their voices directly involved, because I feel like most often we try to help children without involving children, and for me this is the problem, because you can't change something unless you know from them their basic needs, what really is the gap in their lives. So I think involving their children directly and having their voices would be my top priority. And what do you think a child on the move need most to sustain his or her emotional well-being? I think children just need love. They need love more than food, more than, basically they need love more than anything else, because where there's love there's this happy environment, and that where they need counseling, they need to fight the trauma in them. And on the question of what helped you to connect to others in the receiving community, I would say we connected best with fellow children in our shared pain, the shared suffering. We realized we are just so much alike, and we basically are just one person in a different body, because we underwent through the same pain, through the same emotional stress, and we were equally lacking basic needs. So this made us feel like we belong together as children in this. Did belonging to a faith group help you make friends and feel connected? A lot, a lot. I would say our faith was pretty much everything that guided us throughout. Coming from Uganda, a really Christian-based country, we were taught a lot of religious values, and we were always taught the value of loving and respecting each other, and this was shaped by our belief in God. So faith really played a lot of role in my childhood, even though we were on the move. And the last question is, what is your most beautiful memory of this period? Something, wow, yeah. The most beautiful memory, I already told you, and I will tell you again, is always the last week of the month, when you know there's food coming. Because sometimes you run out of food, your family run out of the food supply by the mid of the month, and then you're just not sure where to get it from. So you count down basically days until, and of course, sometimes also my parents had to sell some of the food just to buy something extra to change the diet from beans and posho every day. So always this was an outstanding day, and it was a happy day for everyone, not just me, but my parents too. And of course, also playing with fellow kids was one of my favorite memories. Thank you.
Thank you. So great to hear from Innocent. So much rich feedback from his experience. The concept of listening to children as an act of love, and the tremendous capacity that children have for empathy and building relationships wherever they have that opportunity. Now I would like to invite Laura von St. Andre to provide some remarks. Laura is a senior policy officer in the division tackling the root causes. We're going to have a slight shift. Laura's moving to later in the session. Okay, we are going to introduce our panel to you today. I'm going to introduce each panel. We have three panelists: Miss Celine Monnier, Dr. Rima Salah, and Reverend Dirk Kutzi. I'm going to introduce each of them in more detail right before they speak. And so first, Ms. Celine Monnier, Senior Program Officer at New York University Center on International Cooperation, working on prevention and peace building. Celine has also worked in the policy branch of the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, UN OCHA in New York. supporting principled and effective humanitarian responses, particularly for internally displaced people and migrants. She's advised international organizations, local and national governments on effective violence and crime prevention, and worked in human rights and the diplomatic sector. She has a master's in international law from the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. Over to you, Celine.
Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon to all of you. I'm going to share my screen, so let's see if that actually works. Can someone give me a thumbs up if they're actually seeing my screen? Yes, cool, thank you. Great, so thank you so much for having me, and thank you to the organizer for drawing attention to such an important topic. So as Andrea was saying, I work for the Center on International Cooperation, and just to give you a little bit of context before I start my presentation, I lead a project on prevention and peace building. And what we do is we provide policy analysis and advice to the United Nations around prevention of violence. And so when we do look at prevention, what we want to understand first is what are the reasons why violence happens, what are the root causes. And what's interesting is that at least in UN circles, there's a lot of discussion around, institutions, arms control, maybe development, but there's not a lot around psychology, psychosocial impact. And so it's interesting because it's such an important component. And as one of the interviewee I had was saying, you can really build peace on broken minds. So a few months back, we published an article where we're trying to unpack a little bit the linkages between adverse environments, the impact on mental health and the impact on psychosocial context, and also how that leads to violence. So I'd like to make my presentation around this article. So I want to start by talking a little bit about why violence happens and looking particularly at mental health and social conditions. And so we really have to think about that as an ecosystem, right? And we start by looking at people who are in a very adverse environment, as Innocent was describing. So it could be, for instance, social injustices, if we're thinking about discrimination, if we're thinking about systematic patterns of inequality, lack of access to services, and so on and so forth. And if we're thinking also about people who are suffering directly from violence because they're in a conflict zone, because they suffer torture, also because there are kids that are suffering from domestic violence. And all this create adverse environments that leads to mental suffering, and that leads to what I'm calling social disorganization. And what that means in more simple term is that means it breaks your ability to trust others, and it breaks your ability to trust the state. And it really affects norms and values in a society. So I'd like to unpack one step further, looking at what are the links between mental suffering and violence. And so, in many cases, when you have a lot of mental suffering, it can lead to mental illnesses like anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and so on and so forth. The first thing I would like to highlight before I start explaining the relationship with violence is that most individuals who have mental illnesses are not violent individuals. So I just don't want to have this correlation out of the way. But in certain situations, the adverse environment can create or can lead to more aggressive behavior. And that's the case, for instance, for people who suffer a lot of discrimination that can trigger more violent behavior. People who have post-traumatic stress disorder, so a trauma after a very traumatic event, violent victimization. And here I think Rima is going to talk more about that, but it's really important, for instance, in the case of violence against children that suffer from violence when they're growing up can be more aggressive adults because they learn to repeat pattern of violence, they normalize violence. And we can also look at, for instance, intergenerational trauma and see how they can lead to cycle of revenge and more violence. I also want to quickly unpack the linkages between social disorganization and violence. So the social disorganization, again, that breaking that trust in between individual, breaking the relationship between the individual also and the state, can lead to a loss of sense of belonging and really harm norms and values and principle. And so in certain society, you're starting to see, for instance, normalization of violence as a way to deal with conflict. And all of that really break the social cohesion, which is a very important aspect to build peace. So now that we understand that there is a link between adverse environment, how it affects your psychology as a human, how it affects your relationship with others, we really understand that if we want to build peace or if we want to prevent violence, we need to address those aspects. And the tool to address those aspects is called mental health and psychosocial support, MHPSS, which is a terribly complex acronym, I find. So I just want to unpack it very quickly. Also, what is MHPSS? So MHPSS is different layers of intervention, and this is a pyramid that explains the different components of MHPSS. But basically, they can be divided into two. You can have psychosocial interventions, and those usually are implemented by individuals that are not psychologists, and they really try to foster a relationship between individuals, create a sense of belonging, recreate that social cohesion and that social fabric. And you have the very top of the pyramid, which is the specialized services, and that's really psychologists, psychiatrists, and they're looking more into trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, and so on and so forth. So what that means really is, for instance, you can have community dialogue, you can have child-friendly spaces, you can have reconciliation project, you can have storytelling, you can have efforts to tackle the underlying injustices, and you can have direct therapy. So now that we understand the links between MHPSS and peace, I just want to have a quick look at how they intersect. Because as I was saying earlier, when we talk about violence prevention or peace building, often they don't intersect. Often MHPSS is not even mentioned. But there are some areas that are a little bit better at considering them. And I'm mentioning them because I think we can learn from those areas and bring more of this, what we've learned from them, into the peace building and the prevention field. And the first one are, for instance, humanitarian actors. So they've learned to develop, for instance, guidelines at the UN. They have guidelines on how to do MHPSS in emergency situation. We have the transitional justice field, really has developed a deep understanding of how important it is to heal the traumas and to recreate those social bonds to ensure lasting peace and prevent peace and prevent relapse into conflict. You have reintegration. We also heard Innocent about the reintegration of former child soldiers, and it's really, also obvious the mental impact that such a situation can have on children. And for instance, the UN also developed reintegration guidelines that have an MHPSS aspect for children. And then you have the crime prevention field and the prevention of violent extremism field. And it's interesting because very often when we talk about MHPSS linked to peace, we think about post-conflict, but actually MHPSS tool can also prevent violence from happening in the first place. And the crime prevention field, for instance, has been fairly good at understanding that there are adverse situations at individual, family, community level that can lead individuals to develop more aggressive behavior, and that you can actually address those before that transform into violent action. And so, for instance, they use quite a bit the cognitive behavioral therapy to address those issues. All right, so now if we look at what can we do to increase the use of MHPSS in peace building and prevention, we saw 4 opportunities for governments and the UN to have a more systematic use of MHPSS in peace building or prevention. The first one is to support national capacities, right? Usually there are national capacities, and a good starting point would be to map out what's there and how this can be supported. This can be supported by external actors, by United Nations, and really thinking that sometimes the needs are so great and the resources are really small, right? So there was a report that was published even before the current crisis unfolding in Afghanistan that was saying that over half of the population are suffering from anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder, and only 10% are receiving some kind of MHPSS support. The second aspect is that we really need to think of integrating systematically MHPSS in peace project in everything that we do, right? So government, when they're thinking about their peace building or prevention strategy, they should have a component on MHPSS. Same for the United Nations. And for those who know the United Nations, this is the Peace Building Commission, and that could be a good place to start having this conversation, but also with country teams in country and start looking at it more systematically. The third one is we need to increase expertise, because I think, at least if I haven't completely confused you at this stage, my presentation is showing how complex are those linkages and how to address those issues. So we can really try to facilitate more exchanges between peace builder or prevention experts and MHPSS experts to try to help them feed into each other's expertise. We can also, thank you to this event, for instance, try to raise awareness about how important it is to have MHPSS in peace building. And then finally, I just want to stress the importance of partnership. No one can do that alone. So thinking about government, thinking about civil society actor, thinking, as Innocent was saying, the importance of obviously involving the beneficiaries in what's helpful for them to design and to implement and to monitor, to evaluate, but also involving regional organization, IFIs, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to conclude here. This is the article I was presenting. If you want to have a look, this is the link. And this is my email in case you want to ask any question or have a conversation about this. Thank you very much, and back to you.
Thank you so much for that overview of MHPSS and making those very important linkages between MHPSS, it's a mouthful even to say the acronym, and peace, as well as those 4 key recommendations, kind of concluding with partnerships. With that, I'm going to move to Dr. Rima Sala, the chair of Early Childhood and Peace Consortium at Yale University. She's also the former Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, former Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF, Deputy Special Representative of the Secretary General to the UN mission in Central African Republic in Chad. She served on the United Nations High-Level Independent Panel on Peace Operations and was a volunteer faculty at the Yale Child Study Center. So with that, over to you, Dr. Sala.
Thank you, Andrea. Distinguished participants, it's my great pleasure to be with you today. I wish to express my gratitude to Arigatou International for inviting me to participate in this very important and timely webinar, Resilience and Children on the Move. It is also the time and place to pay tribute to the sponsoring organizations for their tireless efforts to promote, preserve, and protect the well-being of children and their families in all parts of the world. It is my privilege to have the opportunity to talk to you about the impact of violent conflicts and displacement on children, and in particular, the younger one, its impact on their physical, mental health, as well as on their social and emotional development. I will talk also on the importance of the early childhood development strategies and services to mitigate the immediate and long-term impact of humanitarian crises while building a strong foundation for peace, resilience, and social cohesion, and how to ensure the interests of children and their families be at the center of all humanitarian response and recovery efforts. Unfortunately, the year 2020 and 21 have been marked by a rise in violent and conflict and human rights violations, leading to grave humanitarian crises, further exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. And we know we have many countries are now on the news, like, for example, Lebanon, Palestine, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Syria, Venezuela, and other countries where millions of children are in need of humanitarian aid, and thousands of them are in need of mental and psychosocial support. Today, millions of children and their families find themselves trapped in situations of violent conflict and displacement, disrupting the fabric of their societies and compromising the very foundation of their institutions. More children than ever before are now living in conflict zones. At least 250 million children are now living in active conflict zone, exposed to killing, to maiming, recruitment, and use of children, abduction, attacks on schools and hospitals, and particularly denial of humanitarian assistance. But we know when their homes and communities are no more safe havens, and when their streets become battlefields, families flee with their children in search of safety, sometimes thousands of miles away from their homeland. Distinguished participants, this is a time of unprecedented displacement. According to UNHCR report, in the end of 2020, more than 82.4 million people have been forced to flee their homes. 4.8 of them are internally displaced, and 42% of them are children. Those children are exposed to exploitation, to violence, to abduction and detention, xenophobia and discrimination. More than that, they face immense barriers to accessing health services, nutrition and sanitation. And further, the COVID-19 crisis led to the closure of care centers and schools. And the most of those children do not have access to remote learning. So this created an unprecedented crisis of care and learning. Also, closing of education establishments eliminate early warning mechanisms for child abuse and neglect detection and reporting. In the situation of displacement, the vulnerability on the early years is exacerbated by also the separation of its members, the members of the family, and the erosion of all protection system. Most worryingly, the exposure of families and parents to instability and stress challenges their ability to provide for their children who need their protection and nurturing care. But what is even more alarming and should concern us all is the lasting negative of deprivation and violence, the structural and systemic violence on young children, physical and mental health, and their social and emotional development. These detrimental effects will affect our societies and communities. What does science tell us about this? It tells us that the exposure of children to toxic stress and adversity at an early age can impair their neurological development and will likely prevent them from their full development potential. Also, the negative outcome can include emotional and behavioral problems, which can become self-perpetuating, and the cycle will continue for generations. But we can say with confidence that advances in developmental neuroscience and an emerging and well-established bodies of scientific evidence from multiple disciplines, including psychology and education, hold significant implications for the future of millions of children living in fragile and emergency contexts. Evidence-based science continues to substantiate the link between the early years of life and the early life environment with long-term well-being. It also substantiates the link between violence prevention and the development of pro-social behavior that can lead, yes, I can say that can lead to more peaceful communities. The good news and hope, we always have to have good news and hope in the future, and the future is are our children. So the good news and hope is that the emerging science heralds a new era with windows of opportunities through investment in the positive early development of young children. This is as a path, creating a culture of peace and sustaining peace at home, in the community and society. And it's a path to social transformation and also violence prevention. The United Nations and the international community also heralds a new era, a new vision for building peaceful societies, an era where people are at the center of peace and development efforts, an era of partnership, as my colleague before said, partnership with all members of society, including family and children, so that they become agents of change for peace. In my many assignments in countries, I met many people who told me, families and children, listen to us. We can be agents of change, and we can be agents for peace. We are not only victims. That is why the Early Childhood Peace Consortiums and its partners are convinced that early childhood development strategies and services are now more important than ever to mitigate the immediate and long-term impact of humanitarian crises, including the COVID-19 pandemic crisis on the most vulnerable children and their families. Supporting them and empowering them today can only interrupt cycles of deprivation and inequality, but also build a strong foundation for peace, for resilience, and for social cohesion. In this regard, we entreat governments and policymakers to safeguard the increasing undermined rights of young children living in fragile contexts, and to prioritize investment in their survival, in their development and protection, so that they and their families live in peace and dignity. Every family, every child should live in peace and dignity. For the governments, including host governments of refugees and the international community, to reaffirm their commitment to human rights and the rights of children that are undermined in the situations of displacement. Also, for governments to implement more effective and inclusive policies and practices, ensuring that early childhood programs and services are essential in promoting the culture of peace and also in sustaining peace. We also ask responsible actors, international and national, to rethink strategies of early childhood programs that are people-centered. We must build on what people know and give them the space to be the driving force for change. It is vital to have early childhood programs that are multi-level, benefiting not only the child, but their parents and the community. And the program should be safe, protective, inclusive, accessible, and particularly culturally sensitive, to allow children and their families the space to be agents for peace. So last but by not least, our appeal is to religious leaders, faith-based organizations, to assume their important role, to be effective partners for peace-building efforts. They also have powerful assets and influence, and make them prime advocates and the best educators including to young children, including ethical values. Yes, it is our shared responsibility, every one of us, to invest in the future of every child for a more peaceful and just world. And the time is now. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Salah, for such passionate words and a call to action. I think the understanding that 42% of displaced people are children, that in spite of the challenges, there is some good news, that we can build a culture of peace together as we each play our role. And for faith-based organizations and faith actors to assume the important role that we have as partners for peace and for mental health and psychosocial support and early childhood support for children. I'm now going to turn to Reverend Dirk Coetzee, General Manager, Strategic Relations at Petra Children's Ministry. He has served for 16 years as the Managing Director before shifting his focus to mentorship, consultation, strategic partnership, research, and development. His work with Petra has included pioneering work with local faith communities on faith-sensitive mental health and psychosocial support to build children's resilience. He's also an ordained reverend in the United Reformed Church of South Africa. Over to you.
Thank you, Andrea. I'm going to try and share my screen. So let's just see how it goes here. While we are waiting for the screen just to come on. Yeah, I hope you can see it now. Just very shortly about Petra Institute. We are a small training organization in South Africa, based in South Africa. We focus on children's issues, intergenerational issues. So what I'm going to share to you today is basically a story of our intervention or our involvement with the community in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in a town called Beni. Now, why this town is quite important is because Beni has been declared the hotspot, the heart of the Ebola virus outbreak in the 2018s, 2019s. And it is also in a region where there's a lot of strife between rebel forces and the government. So it's a community that has been struggling with a lot of mental health problems, psychosocial problems. And so World Vision asked us to become involved to help train a group of people. Because in our 30 years of work in different countries, in different communities, we discovered exactly what Rima has been saying now, and that is that faith communities, they have the ability and they have the opportunities to provide psychosocial support. But we also discovered that very often faith communities, with all their passion and all their commitment, lack skills and they lack the knowledge to do it effectively. And that is what we have been focusing on. So let me tell you the story of Beni then, because we became involved to help develop some of the skills and the knowledge, the capacity, the ability of a group of leaders. COVID-19 prevented us from visiting the community because that's what we normally do. So we had to do everything online. And that's meant that we only had the opportunity to train 5 people as an initial process. Now, it's vital to understand these 5 people. I have a photo there of these 5. They are representing different faith communities. 2 of them are Muslim religious leaders. And 3 of them are leaders in different denominations of Christian community. So these 5 came together, and so we put them through a process. So let me tell you the story. Okay, let me just see. There are 3 principles inherent in all faith communities. Now, obviously, there are more than 3, but my story will link to these 3. The first is connectedness. It's a very vital element of all communities, and I will say more about that. The second, values, and the third is cascading, or the whole process of passing on what you have received. So let's go to the first one, connectedness. Faith communities is all about relationships, and that is a vital understanding. I think you have to listen again to what Innocent said, because Innocent said, you know, everything that a child desires is actually linked to relationships. And so we took these faith leaders through a process where they practiced very deep principles in terms of connectedness, in terms of relationships, but specifically in terms of relationships with children. One of the things they had to do is they had to go into the community and apply these principles that we taught them in class. And then they would come back. And they came back with amazing stories. And 3 things happened, which I want to highlight. The first one is they discovered the nature of relationships with children. Because they humbly applied the principles of building relationships with children, they discovered that children started treating them as equals, which is a very important aspect, because normally children will not treat adults as equals. They will treat them in a different way. But because these adults were willing to really enter the world, they were treated as equals, and they were invited into the world of these children. And that meant that they discovered the value of cross-age relationships. The second thing they discovered was that they could also build relationships across faith barriers. Now, Pastor Jusla, one of the pastors that attended, he's from the Pentecostal church, and he told us how he used to shun Imam Bulere from the Muslim community because it was just in his nature to see Imam as the enemy. But because they spent time together, long hours, just sharing their lives with each other, they actually became friends. And today they are friends, and they are noticed on the streets of Beni as friends. And people comment about this, and they ask, what happened? What happened? It's because they focused on connectedness. And then also they started to spread this as a culture of acceptance on a wider scale in the community and in different environments where they found themselves. Bulere is the headmaster of a school, and he said that he taught his teachers the very same principles. And then he said his school started to change. Some things just started to fall in place. The relationship between the teachers and the children changed. Children became more committed, more involved in the school. And remember, as we heard from Rima and Celine, trauma has an adverse effect on the children's ability to relate. Because these leaders, they started to change the way that they deal with children, relationships started to heal. The second element that I quickly want to focus on, value. I only highlight 4 values here. Obviously, there's a long list of values, but these are the values that we really wanted to put in place. And if you look at the picture there, you will see the pastor, Mafika, listening very carefully to Mama Shamimu. Now, Mama Shamimu is the wife of one of the Muslim leaders in the community. And this picture portrays the respect and the humility, inclusivity, and obviously the goodwill, just the love and compassion that started to grow between these people. And they took it into the community. And this is what the values that they started to build. Now, none of these values are new. I mean, these are values that faith communities have been thriving on, that they have been building, they are custodians of these values, have been for many ages. But they discovered skills that are linked to the values. And that's the secret. What skills are linked to respect when you show respect to a child? Father Patrick, the Catholic priest, also part of this group, he would sit down in the dust, playing with children because of his humility and respect. He learned skills that goes with these values. And obviously, it started to pick up, and children reacted to this, and also the whole community. The last one, cascading, passing it on, because the whole idea was that this should actually become a movement, a rolling movement, growing through the community, going into the eastern part of the DRC and wider. So these leaders, they accepted the equipment and they accepted ownership. Now they have started to run this process, and they are doing it in the most beautiful ways. Imam Bulere invited Father Patrick to join him in training the members of the mosque. Now, that team, I mean, it was unheard of before that this would ever happen. This is because they found the ownership in themselves of, this is our community, this is our program, these are our values, this is our connectedness that we share. And they are running it into the rest of the DRC. We have seen this same process in a variety of contexts. Every time, adults will come back and they will share stories, how they connected to their own children, how the children started to connect to one another, and how this development of connectedness based on values, enhanced by skills that they have picked up, how this is changing communities. I want to conclude. Faith communities contain everything needed to meet the deep inner needs of children on the move. But sometimes faith leaders just need to connect the dots. So this is what we are called to provide spaces for those connections to happen. Andrea, I thank you.
Thank you for that great example from Benny. I think the faith telling us about how faith communities have the passion but need the skills and the knowledge and the capacity. I think emphasizing that the relationships, the intergenerational relationships, the interfaith relationships, and how that starts small and spills over, and those values rooted in real practical behaviors. I think that's very helpful to think about, and how those partnerships, even that is sort of a peace building effort in itself, as they cascade into the community. Such a lovely example. Now, I'd like to introduce Geli Aroni for some closing remarks, trying to take all this rich content we've heard and condense it. She is the head of the Unit for Integration and the Special Secretariat for the Protection of Unaccompanied Minors in the Ministry of Migration and Asylum. Until 2020, she was the head of the Independent Department for the Coordination and Monitoring of the Refugee Education in the Ministry of Education and Religious Affairs in Greece. And she has extensive experience as a physical education teacher in intercultural schools, where she used cooperative games to promote, through active participation and collaborative learning, the principles, content, and values of democracy education. She's worked as an expert and a trainer in the Council of Europe and European Wergeland Center programs on human rights education and education for democratic citizenship. She has also facilitated workshops for Arigatou International on intercultural and interfaith programs for ethics education in Europe, Asia, and Africa. Over to you.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, distinguished speakers, and thank you, dear participants, for joining us. I have the hard task to summarize, conclude, get the gist of everything that was said, and conclude with the recommendations and what we can do. in order to help the resilience of children on the move and build sustainable cultures of peace. While the distinguished speakers talked, I kept notes, and I have to say that I cheated a little bit because I was privileged enough to have some of their bullet points beforehand. So in order to make it a little bit easier for all of us, I will share my screen, and let me share the notes I took in order to summarize everything that was said. Okay. Let's start. Basic facts. Everybody spoke about these unprecedented displacement that we are facing. An unprecedented displacement with dire consequences to children. We witness violations of children's rights in all sorts, from basic needs, food, water, housing, clothing, to medical support, educational support, social and psychological services. We also heard some of the root causes of violence, some of the root causes of these forced displacement and forced migration. We heard the speakers talk about the structural and systemic violence and the detrimental effects on the mental health of children. We heard about mental suffering and how, if it is prolonged, it can lead to mental illnesses. We heard about how children normalize violence when they grow up in violent environments, how they break social cohesion, and how we need an integrated response if we want to address some of these issues. We need an integrated response that includes mental health and psychosocial support, spiritual nurture, and then we might address some of those issues. We heard about what MHPSS important approach is to support both individuals and communities affected by adversity in their environments. But most of all, I think, at least that's how I heard the speakers talk, I heard that the use of MHPSS approach can be used for prevention, protection, support, and empowerment. This is what we should do. This is what we should strive to work for. Not just protect, but prevent wherever and whenever we can. Then we protect, we support, and we empower children, families, communities, nations. Recommendations, if I may summarize the basic ones. Innocent talked about active participation of children and youth. Children should be directly involved in the decisions and policies concerning their lives. We talk about children and not with children. We plan policies for them, without them. Innocent said that we should listen to children's voices. Innocent also said that love is all children need. And in other words, is what Reverend said, that relationship is what they need. Relationships to help them survive and hope. We heard the Innocent discussing about his friendships, about his playmates. Then we had Miss Céline Monnier. She discussed the UN role, and her recommendations were very well structured in 4 areas of opportunities. We need to support national capacities. How? By building on countries' resources, and playing a capacity building role. By integrating MHPSS as a normal part of sustaining peace strategies, by increasing expertise on MHPSS. Our participants in frequently asked questions was challenging the notion of expertise, asking if by expertise we only mean professionals. As we all know, in local areas, as in Africa, it was the example, we need local people in the ground equipped to get involved in building relationships with them. This is what expertise is, not just the professionals, but people from the national population, locals, faith communities, educators, psychologists, practitioners who work with the children, have relationships with the children, playing with them, listening to them, supporting them. Partnerships was another recommendation that was heard from by all of them. Creative partnerships to support an integrated approach. Dr. Rima Salah continued to discuss about the importance of children and their families and how they should be put in the center of the programs. They're not victims. Usually we think that refugees, children on the move, immigrants are just victims. No, they are and they should be agents of change, agents of peace. We need to invest on early childhood development strategies and programs if we want to reverse the situation, if we want to build peace, resilience, and social cohesion. We need to support and empower children and their families. Governments should protect children's rights, prioritize their survival and their protection. Actors and practitioners should create people-centered programs and build on what people know. Again, the local environment, the locality of what is happening. Reaffirm the commitment on safeguarding the rights of children, all of us. And then we move to the role of faith communities and faith leaders. Dr. Rima Salah finished with a statement of faith leaders and how they should assume their important role in building and sustaining a peaceful and just world, giving the word to Rabbi Kochia, who continued and discussed not only about the importance of the role of faith communities as agents, but also the necessary skills in order for them to have the capacity for this role. He discussed and in his way, he recommended and he reminded on what we should build on when designing programs for capacity building for faith communities. He referred to 3 principles inherent in all faith communities relevant to the topic dealing with resilience. He referred again to relationships, connectedness of people. He referred to values, and he referred to how faith communities, faith leaders have the role, the power to pass values on to others. And I will close with his words. Faith can connect the dots, and faith can provide the space for these connections to happen. Thank you.
Thank you for what was a Herculean effort to bring all of those presentations to us and summarize so well and hit on so many key points and themes. We are going to move into a time of Q&A. So please, we have some questions in the chat to get us started, but please do continue to put questions in that Q&A tab on the bottom. My first question is directed to Rima. specifically. We need to focus more on early childhood development. Do you have best practices to present related to these strategies for our takeaway?
Mhm. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. In fact, I am chairing an early childhood development consortium that have members at Yale and UNICEF, and also World Vision is one of our members. And one of our objectives is to share good practices, and the practices that happen, for example, in Lebanon, in refugee camps, practices where mothers, for example, said themselves that they have been empowered, and this have really the program have really helped them to build relationship with other mothers and other members of communities. Another member from another country, for example, said, now we are not going to have problems among, it is a country in war where there were different ethnic groups, for example, Ivory Coast, were together, and that there was a war, but the early childhood programs had helped mothers to come together. And one mother said, we will not fight again. We are together now. We understand each other. So we have many, examples from many programs in the world, and you can see them on our website also.
Thank you, and we'll be sure to share that in the notes that go out as well, the website link. For Celine, I think Gali started to answer this question in her summary, but what is your understanding of increasing expertise? Is that only professionals? In Africa, it will be difficult to get enough professionals. Is the expertise we need not rather more local people on the ground equipped to get involved in building relationships, listening, playing with, and supporting them?
All right, it's not an easy question, and I don't have an easy answer, and I'll also be interested what others think. But I think there are different levels where we can answer that question. So from my side of, as a researcher working in policies, I think it's really important to increase expertise for the advocacy part, right? So when I engage with, decision makers, I want to be able to show them the evidence that is really important to invest in MHPSS for peace building and for prevention. And so far, when I'm looking at the research, there is a lot that's focused on peace building. So in post-conflict situations, then we're starting to have evidence. But for instance, we could use more evidence in the prevention side and how, adverse environment affects mental health, affects psychosocial, relationship, and how that can lead to more violence. So I think there is an increase in expertise on that level. That's really the research, and that's really putting it on the agenda of the international community. Then there is increasing expertise at the UN, right? And I think that's something that we can really do by, training better some, I'm trying to not use UN jargon here, some individuals that are in key position at field level, for instance, to at least understand that MHPSS is an important component of sustaining peace, and they should know who to reach out to and what to do to include MHPSS in their sustaining peace or in their prevention or in their peace building aspects. And I think here it's also interesting to look at how we can link better different part of the UN system, some that are working on prevention and some that are working on peace building, to make sure that they exchange information more and they are more integrated and they have stronger approaches. Now, the question about national level and what to do in Africa, and I think the question is towards, should we have more psychologists and psychiatrists? And I just want to remind you that if we look at the pyramid of what MHPSS is, psychologists and like psychiatrists is really only the top of the pyramid. So we don't necessarily need only professional psychologists trained to do MHPSS. There is a lot that's about building communities, strengthening those relationships, and so on and so forth. And there, I think the first step, again, is starting with a mapping of what are the resources that already exist in society. And those resources can take very many different forms and shape in different societies. So let's start there and then see how we can complement and add support there. So I wouldn't, I think there is a lot of discussion around the fact that we don't want to medicalize MHPSS either. We really want to recognize that building community is really important and that there is a lot of resources that is already there. And the question is about how to put them more at the forefront and how to support them. And then if needed, complement. Sorry if it was a long answer.
That's great. You also alluded, and this, I can open this up to anyone. What is the, do you all see as the link between MHPSS and advocacy? Perhaps Dr. Salah, you want to start that one?
What is the different, advocacy is that when we advocate, for to change policies, which is we advocate on the higher level through with government, for example, and particularly host countries where refugees are, to safeguard the rights of children, and also work with other actors to have programs in mental health, but and at the local level. The most important, the Reverend Kotze, I think, talked about at the local level what we can do, and this is also very, very important. So the advocacy should be at all levels. It should start at, of course, with the governments and policy makers, but also advocate with families and children. Yeah, they are part of all, these programs. So advocacy is very important, and also programs in mental health, psychosocial services are very important to empower families and communities, as I said, to assume their role. As they are not only victims, as they always say, and they have told me this on several occasions. So I think both are important. We need the advocacy at the higher level with governments to change policies and to include programs that will really empower families and communities. And we had several examples today here.
Thanks, that's excellent. Now, in conflict areas like Mali, what can be the MHPSS within peacekeeping groups, as well as humanitarian actors? Go ahead, Celine.
Sorry, I'm saying Kelly with
Andreas, Celine, please go ahead.
I'm seeing Gelly with her hand up.
Oh,
yeah, I wanted to add to Rima though, to advocacy.
Go ahead.
Yes.
And then we'll go to the next one. Go ahead.
I wanted to add and agree with what Rima discussed about advocacy, because I think that advocacy is in every individual. It's not just on the higher level, but just you people being here, us being here, discussing about the importance of psychosocial support, taking out the stigma of mental health and putting it up front is advocacy. Just talking with our friends and people and relatives and neighbors about being a refugee is just a temporary status. It's not an identity. Mm-hmm. These people, I mean, it's not their identity. They're not refugees, They are a lot of things. They are professionals. They are teachers and doctors and psychologists. They are people and they have names. And this is why I did not repeat the numbers, because I'm sick and tired of discussing numbers. They are people with true identities. And this is advocacy. Just saying that, just passing this on to the people you associate with is advocacy.
Yeah.
It doesn't have,
And just maybe one word to that, and to uphold the dignity of every person. Everyone has it. This is very, very important, the dignity of every refugee who is now, or she's a refugee, but they were not before and they will not be after. The dignity is very important.
Thank you for that.
Andrea, may I add something to this before you go to the next question? What we found is, advocacy has different levels, or let's say the whole process. The one is that people must be made aware. So sometimes people are just blind. They are not aware of what's going on. The second thing is they must make a paradigm shift very often, because they might be aware, but they still haven't made that paradigm shift. They haven't had values actually kicking in. Can I just give one small example? We often find working with churches, big, like sort of on the major levels. If you ask them, do you care for children? I have not met any single religious leader who said, no, I don't care about children. Everybody cares about children. But when you ask them, so what is your paradigm? How are you going to address children? Almost everybody goes into an educational paradigm. To say, no, we're going to develop better educational systems. So the paradigm is wrong. And that's why we are trying to change the paradigm. Say, you're working in the wrong paradigm. You have to change to a relational paradigm, and then everything will change. All right, so the first one, awareness. The second one, paradigms. But then the third one is capacity. Just the competency to do something, because you often find that people say, I really want to help these children, I just don't know how. And those are the three levels that are, all of them are important, and different people play different roles on these three levels.
Thanks. That's great. That's great. Such rich answers to that question. Let's go to the question about conflict and the role MHPSS could play, or maybe the role that peacekeeping groups and humanitarian actors should be playing in the MHPSS kind of system or continuum. Celine, can I throw that one at you?
I feel like I've been volunteered. So I don't want to speak about the specific case of Mali because I don't have an expertise on Mali, but what I can say in general is that my understanding is that at the UN, the humanitarian actors actually have guidelines on MHPSS and how to ensure that there is some kind of support in emergency settings. The second thing, when we're looking particularly at peace building, what we want to do is have an analysis of what are the needs for peace, right? And you need that analysis to be at country level, but more importantly, you need to have that analysis at local level, and hopefully led by local actors with the support of the United Nations, right? And so when we do this analysis of why is there violence and what is blocking the situation from becoming, more peaceful, then we should have enough expertise to understand what aspects are linked to mental health and psychosocial conditions. And that should be integrated in your analysis, and that should be integrated in your response. Because what I know about prevention, or what I know about peace building, is that building peace is really about addressing as many possible as those root causes and have an integrated strategy, right? We never have one answer for peace. We need many different ones, and MHPSS should definitely be one of them. And we need to understand enough about it to be able to do this analysis and to know how to design a response. So that would be my quick one. I'm wondering if Rima would, with her extensive experience at the UN, would have a little bit more to add.
Please. Rima, your mute is still on.
Yes, again, yes. So of course, this is all very important, the research and all this. What is more important, as I said, is to work with the people. I think the question came from Mali, right? And I have very great experience. I was the regional director for UNICEF, and Mali was one of my very important countries. So I worked there, and I saw the resilience of people there, particularly after all the problems and all this. So I have, faith in all of you, in every one of you. It's so important that you work for, of course, support psychosocial services, and also for all the internal. They have refugees in Mali, but they are the internally displaced in Mali also that have fled from violence and all this. So I'm very, proud of Mali and the work they are doing, and to continue the research, and also to continue the work of the non-governmental organizations that are very important there. And just to tell you that we are now, the Early Childhood Development and Queen's University is undertaking a research in Mali to show the importance of early childhood development programs in Mali, and we do it with the Malian, educators, to see the importance of early childhood development in building peace and resilience in communities. And we have already some of those results that really it has a big impact in bringing societies and families together. Thank you.
That's great. Okay, we had a question come through in Spanish. How can we link good practices and programs and projects in vulnerable communities with faith leaders? Maybe Dirk, you could start on that one.
Yeah, we start by saying that the values and these things that I mentioned, they are already part of faith communities. So it's not something new that you have to bring, but people need to learn skills of how to implement those values into the real life of the community. And those skills can be taught, and people are very willing, they are very open to learn those skills. So this is the process that we have been following. I mean, one of the countries that we have been working in recently was Nicaragua, where we also trained people in the Nicaraguan context to apply these basic skills of developing relationships, basic listening skills, basic skills of just hearing what the other one is saying, and especially children. Basic skills of communicating with children through specific ways of playing. I mean, I'm just mentioning very, very simple things. Narratives, telling stories, these are very basic skills, but they are fundamental. And if they learn these skills, then we have found that faith leaders, they start to have a greater influence, but also they are influenced more. They receive the influence from children even. Children start changing their minds. So I'm not sure whether I'm answering the question, but it is very much on the level of just helping people to become who they already are by adding value to what they have.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So perhaps on the kind of the other side, as we're trying to link those, as those faith leaders are developing those skills, how are we able to link that in with a broader kind of system in some of the work? And maybe that's over to you, Rima, for some thoughts.
Excuse me again, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so as faith leaders and faith communities develop these skills, what are some steps maybe we can take to ensure that those and the work that they're doing is linked into kind of the broader system and work of the UN and other actors?
Yes, yeah, that is why it's very important to expose. I think faith leaders and the organization first should present at the United Nations. Your voices should be heard. Some of them are heard, but not all the time. I think your voices, the voices of religious leaders, of faith-based organization should be heard at the United Nations, because you not only bring your voices, but you bring the voices of the people you serve. And this is very important. We need to hear their voices. And so I think we will see how we can include you in some of our programs. And particularly, I'm not now an official of the United Nations, but can advocate, for example, that the faith leaders programs should be exposed. We don't know. I've heard some of the programs today and another for the first time. So we should know more about them. And they should be part of the programs of peace building. You know, we have an office of peace building at the United Nations. So and maybe Celine knows that. And I think your programs should be part of the solution. We talk about the rule of law, the justice system, because I was in peace building, but we do not talk about what people are doing and other programs. So we need to do, and again, we come to advocacy that we should really bring those voices to the United Nations and to the international community.
Excellent, thank you. Gelly, go ahead. You will have the last word before I close us out.
I wanted to add to what Rima and Dirk said. When we had the major influx of refugees back in 2015, and I was working on the field, it was really ironic that faith communities were there. They were on the field from day number 1. And so was prayer that I saw in one of the comments, but they're never there in the decision makers' tables. Yes. I mean, there is a huge gap. They were there first and they reacted first to the influx, but they are never included when decisions are made.
I think to add, as James said, they should be part of the response. They should be part of the response, of the humanitarian response, and particularly recovery, which is very important, because it's not only humanitarian. It's not only humanitarian response, but it is also to recovery and development.
Yes. Yes, that is a great closing question and closing comments from the panel. I want to thank each of you for your really thoughtful contributions and preparation and willingness to take questions quickly today. Thank you to all who participated as actively in the chat and shared your questions. Just a reminder, this is the first of 3 in a virtual event series. Our next event will be October 6th, followed by one on November 3rd. So please do join us. We are thankful for your time today, and I hope you all go in peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.